The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Part 1, Eggs and the Buchanans. I always start off by telling my students to make sure they know that, and I get them to write it in there at the very beginning, Nick is telling the story. When I was younger, my teacher didn't tell me, and I'm ashamed to admit that it took me longer than it should have to know that Gatsby wasn't the one telling the story. So a character named Nick is telling the story. Write that at the top. In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. Underline that advice that Nick's father gave him. It's a good life lesson. Some of us are born with certain advantages and some of us aren't. And he apparently is from more advantage than other people. And so his father is teaching him from a very young age that he shouldn't criticize people because they have not always come from the background that he has. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way. And I understood that he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. So basically, because he's friendly and he accepts people for who they are, many people talk to him, and many people, because he keeps listening, they keep talking. And he doesn't always like that, but again, he's friendly, and so he just listens. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person. And so it came about that in college, I was unjustly accused of being a politician because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. Because he knew some secrets from people, because again, they wanted to talk to him and he just listened. People assumed that he was kind of keeping them in his back pocket for later, or the type of thing that a politician would do. Again, just friendly. Most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently, I feigned sleep, preoccupation, or a hostile levity when I realized by some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon. So he says when he realizes that people are going to start confiding in him, he feigns sleep, and that means pretends. So he either pretends to be busy or pretends to be asleep because he doesn't want to hear it. That's not his thing. For the intimate revelations of young men, or at least in terms of which they express them, are usually plagiaristic and marred by obvious suppressions. Reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope. Underline that. Reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope. If we don't put a judgment on someone, and if we don't assume something from someone because of the way they look or where they're from or how they dress, we're never going to be, quote unquote, let down. That's what it means that there's that infinite hope. They're always going to be, that good person, or that there's always going to be hope for that person if you never, ever, want them to be something else or cast a judgment on them. I am still a little afraid of missing something if I forget that, as my father snobbishly suggested, and I snobbishly repeat, a sense of the fundamental decencies is parceled out unequally at birth. So he realized this is the first beginning of Fitzgerald speaking of classes. There's a definite upper, lower, middle class here. And after boasting of this way of my tolerance, I come to the admission that it has a limit. Conduct may be founded on the hard rock or wet marshes, but after a certain point, I don't care what it's founded on. When I came back from the East last autumn, I felt that I wanted the world to be in uniform and at a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have unaffected scorn. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him. Some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away. So, this is the first description that we get of Gatsby. So, I'm going to go back and read it, and I want you to highlight it. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away. What does this mean? What is he trying to say about Gatsby? Definitely these machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away, they have to be sensitive. And so they have to be aware. So think of it in terms like that. Nick is going to talk about Gatsby and like very flattering. And it's in a way that in the 1920s that men spoke about other men. We've kind of adopted we're not allowed to say, like, if you're a man, you're not supposed to talk that way about like friendship on other men because it might make you a homosexual or it might make you seem, and you have to, I know all of you, some of us have to put no homo after the end of it. It's not like that. He is very appreciative of Gatsby and he is aware of Gatsby's like qualities. And so that's the way he's going to talk about him. Okay. This responsiveness had nothing to do with that flabby impressionability, which is dignified under the name of creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person, and which is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right in the end. It was what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams, that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and the short-winded elations of men. Okay, so this is kind of he's telling us that he's going back and telling this story. When he writes this, the book has already happened. Does that make sense? If not, it will. My family have been prominent, well-to-do people in the middle western city for 3 generations. The Carraways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition that we're descended from the dukes of something I can't pronounce. But the actual founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, who came here in 51, sent a substitute to the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business that my father carries on today. I never saw this great uncle, but I'm supposed to look like him, with special reference to the rather hard-boiled painting that hangs in father's office. I graduated from New Haven in 1915, just a quarter of a century after my father, and a little later I participated in that delayed Teutonic migration known as the Great War. So right here you want to mark that New Haven is Yale, Y-A-L-E, and you might know from your history classes that the Great War is World War I. So he went to Yale like his father, and he was in World War I. I enjoyed the counter raid so thoroughly that I came back restless. Instead of being the warm center of the world, the Middle West now seemed like the ragged edge of the universe. So I decided to go east and learn the bond business. Everybody I knew was in the bond business, so I supposed it could support one more single man. All my aunts and uncles talked it over as if they were choosing a prep school for me, and finally said, "Why, yes," with very grave, hesitant faces. Father agreed to finance me for a year, and after various delays, I came east, permanently, I thought, in the spring of 22. Okay, so now a couple things with what we've read so far. The bond business is like on Wall Street, selling bonds and things like that. So he's decided that because he doesn't, in the Middle West where he's living with his family, after the war, he just felt a little restless and he wants to do something. So he says, I'll move east. Lots of people in his family had already been in the bond business. So he said, okay, I'll do this. His father agrees to finance him for a year. Basically, that means until he gets on his feet and until he starts making his own money, his father is going to pay his rent and pay his bills for him. Okay. Now, please understand that they are the Carraways, his family. They're not super, super rich, but they're well-to-do. they can afford to, pay for their son for a year, that kind of thing. Now we also have a setting. Remember, setting is time and place. So it's the spring of 1922, and it's the East, basically. And I'll go ahead and tell you that means it's New York. The practical thing was to find rooms in the city, but it was a warm season, and I had just left a country of wide lawns and friendly trees. So when a young man at the office suggested that we take a house together in a commuting town, it sounded like a great idea. He found the house, a weather-beaten cardboard bungalow at $80 a month. But at the last minute, the firm ordered him to Washington, and I went out to the country alone. I had a dog. At least I had him for a few days until he ran away. And an old Dodge and a Finnish woman who made my bed and cooked breakfast and muttered Finnish wisdom to herself over the electric stove. Okay, so his dog is gone. We won't even get into that. A Dodge is a car. And the Finnish woman is someone who that's her nationality, is Finnish. And she basically cleans up for him. And remember, this is a time when men weren't real handy with the woman was supposed to do that. So a man who doesn't live with a woman who's just left his parents' house, he's not going to really know the cooking and cleaning and things like that. And obviously, if his dad's paying for it, he can afford to have this woman come and help him out like that. She doesn't live there. She just comes in and cleans up and stuff. It was lonely for a day or so until one morning, some man, more recently arrived than I, stopped me on the road. "How do you get to West Egg Village?" he asked helplessly. I told him. And as I walked on, I was lonely no longer. I was a guide, a pathfinder, an original settler. He had casually conferred on me the freedom of the neighborhood. So once he was able to not be the newest guy, he felt a little less lonely. And so with the sunshine and the great burst of leaves growing on the trees, just as things grow in fast movies, I had that familiar conviction that life was beginning over again with the summer. There was so much to read, for one thing, and so much fine health to be pulled down out of the young, breath-giving air. I bought a dozen volumes on banking and credit and investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and gold like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas and Morgan and Maecenas knew. Hold on just a second. Say, stop. And I had the high intention of reading many other books besides. I was rather literary in college. One year I wrote a series of very solemn and obvious editorials for the Yale News. And now I was going to bring back all such things in my life and become again that most limited of all specialists, the well-rounded man. This isn't just an epigram. Life is much more successfully looked at from a single window after all. Okay, this next part is going to describe some places where he lives, and there's a map that you've been given, or it's on your Google Classroom, that shows that there are two separate communities, and they are separated by some water. Okay, so this right here is going to explain and describe West Egg and East Egg. It was a matter of chance that I should have rented a house in one of the strangest communities in North America. It was on that slender, riotous island which extends itself due east of New York, and where there are, among other natural curiosities, two unusual formations of land. 20 miles from the city, a pair of enormous eggs, identical in contour and separated only by a courtesy bay, jut out into the most domesticated body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere, the great wet barnyard of Long Island Sound. They are not perfect ovals, like the egg in the Columbus story. They are both crushed flat at the contact end, but their physical resemblance must be a source of perpetual confusion to the gulls that fly overhead. To the wingless, a more arresting phenomenon is their dissimilarity in every particular except shape and size. So while they look the same, they look like two different eggs, kind of like smushed. That's really what Nick is saying is the only similarity that they have. I lived at West Egg, less fashionable of the two, though this is a most superficial tag to express the bizarre and not a little sinister contrast between them. My house was at the very tip of the egg, only 50 yards from the Sound, and squeezed between two huge places that rented for 12 or 15,000 a season. So this shows you his tiny little bungalow, which is 80 a month, sits in between these two huge mountains on West Egg. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard. It was the factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side, spanking new under a thin beard of raw ivy, and a marble swimming pool, and more than 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gatsby's mansion. So this is your, right here, mark this. This is your description of Gatsby's mansion. Or rather, as I didn't know Mr. Gatsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. My own house was an eyesore, but it was a small eyesore, and it had been overlooked. So I had a view of the water, a partial view of my neighbor's lawn, and the consoling proximity of millionaires, all for $80 a month. So an eyesore, is something that it hurts to look at. It hurts your eye. So that's what his little tiny bungalow is, but it had kind of been overlooked and kind of been forgotten about. So he really kind of has a good deal by being among all these like millionaires, but only paying $80 a month. Across the Courtesy Bay, the white palaces of the fashionable East Egg glittered along the water. And the history of the summer really begins on the evening I drove over there to have dinner with the Tom Buchanans. Okay, so right now I need you to understand that both East Egg and West Egg have millionaires that live there. It's a very like ritzy, luxurious, they're like neighborhoods or like places that have, the people there have lots of money. However, he says that West Egg is less fashionable and East Egg is more fashionable. Let me explain what that means. People who have grown up with money, who have family money, old money that they've always had that is kind of just passed down to them, they live on East Egg. That's the fashionable rich, okay? It's more fashionable in these days, to have family money, old money. The people on West Egg, that's new money. These are people that have just gotten to be millionaires. Now, going back to our notes and the things that we talked about, usually, not in every case, I'm sure, but usually the new money was earned through bootlegging or the speakeasies or gambling or things like that. And so it wasn't looked at as respectable. Okay. You still had as much money as the old money, but people kind of, the rich on East Egg, they kind of looked down on you because, you had gotten it in an illegal way. So you need to know the difference in that. West Egg is new money. East Egg is old money. Okay. Now he's talking about the Tom Buchanans. This is where he goes. Nick lives on West Egg, and so does Gatsby. And he is traveling over to East Egg to have dinner with Tom and Daisy Buchanan. Daisy was my second cousin once removed, and I had known Tom in college. And just after the war, I had spent 2 days with them in Chicago. Okay, now there's going to be a question about this in your parts, so I need you to pay attention to this. This is a description of Tom in college when he was at in Yale or at New Haven, with Nick. Her husband, Tom, among various physical accomplishments, had been one of the most powerful ends that ever played football at New Haven, a national figure in a way. One of those men who reached such an acute, limited excellence at 21 that everything afterwards savors the anticlimax. His family were enormously wealthy. Even in college, his freedom with money was a matter for reproach. But now he had left Chicago and come east in a fashion that rather took your breath away. For instance, he had brought down a string of polo ponies from Lake Forest. It was hard to realize that a man in my own generation was wealthy enough to do that. So while in college, his most important role and what he was known for was football. And basically, he was very powerful. He was very popular. He was very wealthy even then. And again, he didn't work for this money. His parents just had it. But the fact that he kind of like peaked at 21. This was like his heyday, his most important part of his life. So now that he's not 21, it's kind of like not as like he's gotten older. He's kind of moved on from that, but in his mind, he still remembers being an important football player at Yale. So that's part of the description of Tom then. Why they'd come east, I don't know. They had spent a year in France for no particular reason, and then drifted here and there unrestfully, wherever people played polo and were rich together. This was a permanent move, said Daisy over the telephone, but I didn't believe it. I had no sight into Daisy's heart, but I felt that Tom would drift on, forever seeking, a little wistfully, for that dramatic turbulence of some irrecoverable football game. So he's kind of always kind of be locked in the past and wanting to be that 21-year-old who was, popular for football. And so it happened that on a warm, windy evening, I drove over to East Egg to see two old friends whom I scarcely knew at all. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected, a cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The lawn started at the beach and ran toward the front door for a quarter of a mile, jumping over sundials and brick walls and burning gardens. Finally, when it reached the house, drifting up the side in bright vines, as though from the momentum of its run. The front was broken by a line of French windows, glowing now with reflected gold and wide open to the warm, windy afternoon. And Tom Buchanan, in riding clothes, was standing with his legs apart on the front porch. Riding clothes meaning he's been riding horses. Now, this part right here is his description of Tom now. Okay, remember he was, physically built as a football player, and he was really popular. But listen to him now. He had changed since his New Haven years. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30, with a rather hard mouth and a supercilious manner. Two shining, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Not even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to feel those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing, and you could see a great pack of muscle shifting when his shoulder moved under his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. So how do you feel like he, just by his physical, the way that Nick describes him physically, how do you feel like he is as a person? Think about why he uses the words a rather hard mouth, arrogant eyes, established dominance over his face, the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward, the great pack of muscle. It was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. He doesn't seem the friendliest, does he? He doesn't seem like, easygoing or kind of thing. He's kind of like maybe, I don't know, just more aggressive. I kind of like a bullying a feeling over it. I don't know. His speaking voice, a gruff, husky tenor, added to the impression of fractiousness he conveyed. There was a touch of paternal contempt in it, even toward people he liked, and there were men at New Haven who had hated his guts. So again, you hear fractiousness, and that's like a rebellious nature, and contempt. These words like that are describing him. He doesn't seem like the most fun-loving guy or the most, accepted. Now, don't think my opinion on these matters is final, he seemed to say, just because I'm stronger and more of a man than you are. We were in the same senior society, and while we were never intimate, I always had the impression that he approved of me and wanted me to like him with some harsh, defiant wistfulness of his own. We talked for a few minutes on the sunny porch. I've got a nice place here, he said, his eyes flashing about restlessly. Turning me around by one arm, he moved a broad, flat hand along the front vista, including in its sweep a sunken Italian garden, a half-acre of deep, pungent roses, and a snub-nosed motorboat that bumped on the tide offshore. It belonged to Domain, the oil man. He turned me around again, politely and abruptly. We'll go inside. So he's super proud of, all his money and his house and stuff. And he's literally like turning Nick to show him, like, look at this, look what I have. Look, I have a great place. Look at this. Did you see that? Did you see the boat? Did you see who, do you know who owned that? So he's not being very humble right now. We walk through a hall. No, sorry, we'll start again. We walk through a high hallway into a bright, rosy colored space, fragilely bound to the house by French windows at either end. The windows were ajar and gleaming white against the fresh grass outside that seemed to grow a little way into the house. A breeze blew through the room, blew the curtains in at one end and out the other like pale flags, twisting them up toward the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling, and then rippled over the wine-colored rug, making a shadow on it as the wind does on the sea. The only completely stationary object in the room was an enormous couch on which two young women were buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. They were both in white, and their dresses were rippling and fluttering as if they had just been blown back in after a short flight around the house. I must have stood for a few minutes, listening to the whip and snap of the curtains and the groan of a picture on the wall. Then there was the boom as Tom Buchanan shut the rear window and the caught wind died out about the room, and the curtains and the rugs and the two young women ballooned slowly to the floor. So he walks in, it's very open, it has like these flowing curtains and all these things, just very wispy and lots of room. And there's two women that look like they're just kind of floating. They're not really, they're in these white dresses, and it's just very like kind of ethereal. It's not, hard and jagged. It just looks kind of like free. And he's just standing there like taking it all in. The younger of the two was a stranger to me. She was extended full length at her end of the divan, completely motionless, and with her chin raised a little, as if she were balancing something on it, which was quite likely to fall. So this is her chin right here. What does it remind you of? She has her chin up like that, and it's like she's balancing something on there, and if she lets it down, then it might fall. Maybe a little stuck up, a little snobby. If she saw me out the corner of her eyes, she gave no hint of it. Indeed, I was almost surprised into murmuring an apology for having disturbed her by coming in. This is, we don't know her name yet, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you, this is Jordan Baker. Okay, this is the first time that he sees her. He doesn't know who she is, just a stranger. But his first impression is that she doesn't even like look at him. When somebody walks in the room, you usually look, right? Or you stand if you don't know them and you introduce yourself. No, she's just kind of. The other girl, Daisy, made an attempt to rise. She leaned slightly forward with a conscientious expression. Then she laughed, an absurd, charming little laugh. And I laughed too, and came into the room. I'm paralyzed with happiness. She laughed again, as if she had said something very witty, and held my hand for a moment, looking up into my face, promising that there was no one in the world that she so much wanted to see. That was a way she had. She hinted in a murmur that the surname of the balancing girl was Baker. I've heard it said that Daisy's murmur was only to make people lean toward her, an irrelevant criticism that made it no less charming. Okay, so again, Nick is going to talk about Daisy, which in a way that sounds romantic, but it's not. It's his cousin, but she's just beautiful, and he can't help but notice that. And she's charming, and it doesn't mean anything, but she flirts. She flirts with every man, and so she's flirting with him, and she's like, oh, and she holds his hand a little bit longer, and so that right there is your description of Daisy. When she looks at him or at anybody, it makes them feel like she's that person that she's looking at is the only person that she wants to see. That's quite a look. And then she murmurs, and it says in parentheses that people say that she murmurs to men just so that men will get closer to her. That's kind of like her thing. And I kind of like it. I couldn't get away with it, but I like it. At any rate, Miss Baker's lips fluttered. She nodded at me almost imperceptibly, and then quickly tipped her head back again. The object she was balancing had obviously tottered a little and given her something of a fright. Again, a sort of apology arose to my lips. Almost any exhibition of complete self-sufficiency draws a stunned tribute from me. I looked back at my cousin, who began to ask me questions in her low, thrilling voice. It was the kind of voice that the ear follows up and down, as if each speech is an arrangement of notes that will never be played again. So this is still, you want to mark this as descriptions of Daisy. Her face was sad and lovely with bright things in it, bright eyes and a bright, passionate mouth. But there was an excitement in her voice that men who had cared for her found difficult to forget. A singing compulsion, a whispered, listen, a promise that she had done gay, exciting things just a while since, and that there were gay, exciting things hovering in the next hour. So again, this is a way, and these descriptions of Daisy is that men find her attractive. She's beautiful and she's charming, but it's just in her way. They don't know anything about her. She doesn't talk about important things or talk about things going on in the world. It's just the way that she looks at them or the way that she laughs or the way that she talks. They just are drawn to her. She's beautiful. Okay. But again, there's no real substance to her. It's just the outward appearances. I told her how I had stopped off in Chicago for a day on my way east, and how a dozen people had sent their love through me. Do they miss me? She cried ecstatically. The whole town is desolate. All the cars have the left rear wheel painted black as a mourning wreath, and there's a persistent wail all night along the North Shore. How gorgeous. Let's go back, Tom, tomorrow. Then she added irrelevantly, you ought to see the baby. I'd like to. She's asleep. She's 3 years old. Haven't you ever seen her? Never. Well, you ought to see her. Tom Buchanan, who had been hovering restlessly about the room, stopped and rested his hand on my shoulder. What are you doing, Nick? I'm a bondman. Who with? I told him. Never heard of him, he remarked decisively. This annoyed me. You will, I answered shortly. You will if you stay in the East. Oh, I'll stay in the East. Don't you worry, he said, glancing at Daisy and then back at me, as if he were alert for something more. I'd be a damn fool to live anywhere else. At this point, Miss Baker said, absolutely, with such suddenness that I started. It was the first word she had uttered since I came into the room. Evidently, it surprised her as much as it did me, for she yawned and, with a series of rapid, deft movements, stood up into the room. I'm stiff, she complained. I've been lying on that sofa for as long as I can remember. Don't look at me, Daisy retorted. I've been trying to get you to New York all afternoon. No, thanks, said Miss Baker to the 4 cocktails just in from the pantry. I'm absolutely in training. Her host looked at her incredulously. You are? He took down his drink as if it were a drop in the bottom of a glass. How you ever get anything done is beyond me. Okay, so I'm going to stop right there for a second and make sure that you mark a few things on this page. We learn here at the top of the page that Daisy and Tom have a daughter. She's 3 years old. Okay, so mark that. And then Jordan starts talking, and we find out that she's in training. And we're going to find out what that's for. But go back a page. I love that Nick is kind of sarcastic with her, but he's kind of like teasing her. And she's, when they're talking about Chicago, and he kind of feeds her ego. He knows that it's pretty harmless. And so he's like, do they miss me? And he's like, oh my goodness, it's all they talk about. They can't stop crying. I like that about Nick. And she knows it. She's, Okay. So go to 11, page, 11. I looked at Miss Baker, wondering what it was that she got done. I enjoyed looking at her. Underline that. I enjoyed looking at her. This is he gets to see more of her. Now, this is the one that he's not related to, so he can look at her romantically or appreciatively. Okay, listen to what he says. She was a slender, small-breasted girl with an erect carriage, which she accentuated by throwing her body backward at the shoulders like a young cadet. Her gray, sun-strained eyes looked back at me with polite, I can't say the word, but it's like being reciprocated, curiosity out of a wan, charming, discontented face. It occurred to me now that I had seen her or a picture of her somewhere before. You live in West Egg, she remarked contemptuously. I know somebody there. I don't know a single. You must know Gatsby. Gatsby? Demanded Daisy. What Gatsby? Before I could reply that he was my neighbor, dinner was announced. Wedging his tense arm imperatively under mine, Tom Buchanan compelled me from the room as though he were moving a checker to another square. Okay, so we're going to come back to this particular exchange here. Jordan knows someone in West Egg, and Nick, who just moved there, says, I don't know anybody. And she's like, well, of course you know Gatsby. Daisy hears the name Gatsby and immediately turns and says, what Gatsby? So remember this, okay? Nick is not able to explain that that's his neighbor, or that I don't know him, I haven't met him, but I live beside him, because dinner is announced. Slenderly, languidly, their hands set lightly on their hips, the two young women preceded us out into the rosy-colored porch, open toward the sunset, where 4 candles flickered on the table in the diminished wind. Why candles? Objected Daisy, frowning. She snapped them out with her fingers. In 2 weeks, it'll be the longest day of the year. She looked at us all radiantly. Do you always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it? I always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it. We ought to plan something, yawned Miss Baker, sitting down at the table as if she were getting into bed. All right, said Daisy. What do we plan? She turned to me helplessly. What do people plan? Before I could answer, her eyes fastened on... Start over. Before I could answer, her eyes fastened with an odd expression on her little finger. Look, she complained. I heard it. We all looked. The knuckle was black and blue. You did it, Tom, she said accusingly. I know you didn't mean to, but you did do it. That's what I get for marrying a brute of a man. A great, big, hulking physical specimen of a... I hate that word hulking, objected Tom crossly. Even in king. Hulking, insisted Daisy. Sometimes she and Miss Baker talked at once, unobtrusively and with a bantering inconsequence that was never quite chatter, that was as cool as their white dresses and their impersonal eyes in the absence of all desire. They were here, and they accepted Tom and me, making only a polite, pleasant effort to entertain or to be entertained. They knew that presently dinner would be over, and a little later in the evening, too, would be over and casually put away. It was sharply different from the West, where an evening was hurried from phase to phase toward its close, in a continually disappointed anticipation, or else in sheer nervous dread of the moment itself. So throughout dinner, the women are talking to each other, just kind of in like insignificant chatter, just talking, and they're not really paying a lot of attention to the men. They're like, they're there, and we're glad they're there, but we're just going to talk to ourselves. Okay. And so Nick's just he's looking at this world where, like I said, his family has a little bit of money, but it's nowhere near what the Buchanans have. You make me feel uncivilized, Daisy, I confessed on my second glass of corky but rather impressive claret. I don't know how you say that, but it's alcohol, like a wine. Can't you talk about crops or something? I meant nothing in particular by this remark, but it was taken up in an unexpected way. Civilization's going to pieces, broke out Tom violently. I've gotten to be a terrible pessimist about things. Have you read The Rise of the Colored Empires by this man Goddard? Why, no, I answered, rather surprised by his tone. Well, it's a fine book, and everybody ought to read it. The idea is that if we don't look out, the white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's been proved. Okay, so in your part 1 questions, they're going to ask you about Tom's character and what you learn about him. The fact that he brings up this book called The Rise of the Colored Empire. What does this tell you about Tom and about how he sees people that are a different race from him? So this will be your first clue as to one of his not so nice characteristics that you learn. Okay. And I love that he says, because it's in a book, that it's proven. Okay. That makes it right. Tom's getting very profound, said Daisy with an expression of unthoughtful sadness. He reads deep books with long words in them. What was that word well, these books are all scientific, insisted Tom, glancing at her impatiently. This fellow has worked out the whole thing. It's up to us, who are the dominant race, to watch out, or these other races will have control over things. Okay, so again, this is your textual evidence for the fact that Tom is racist. Now, can you imagine being Daisy, his wife, and she's trying to like maybe change the subject because this isn't a very nice thing to be talking about, right? Especially in front of someone they don't really know, but they're getting reacquainted with. But he talks over her, he shuts her off, and he looks at her impatiently, so he's not very nice toward her. And again, Daisy is trying to, I don't know, like change the subject or like make jokes to kind of make it okay. So she says, "We've got to beat them down," whispered Daisy, winking ferociously toward the fervent sun. "You ought to live in California," began Miss Baker, but Tom interrupted her by shifting heavily in his chair. "The idea is that we're all Nordics. I am, and you are, and after an infinitesimal hesitation, he included Daisy with a slight nod, and she winked at me again. "And we've produced all these things that go to make civilizations. Oh, science and art and all that. Do you see?" There was something pathetic in his concentration, as if his complacency, more acute than of old, was not enough to him anymore. When, almost immediately, the telephone rang inside and the butler left the porch, Daisy seized upon the momentary interruption and leaned toward me. "I'll tell you a family secret," she whispered enthusiastically. "It's about the butler's nose. Do you want to hear about the butler's nose? That's why I came over tonight." Well, he wasn't always a butler. He used to be the silver polisher for some people in New York that had a silver service for 200 people. He had to polish it from morning till night, until finally it began to affect his nose. "Things went from bad to worse," suggested Miss Baker. "Yes, things went from bad to worse until finally he had to give up his position." For a moment, the last sunshine fell with romantic affection upon her glowing face. Her voice compelled me forward breathlessly as I listened. Then the glow faded, each light deserting her with a lingering regret, like children leaving the pleasant street at dusk. So they're making a joke, okay? The butler obviously has a big nose. And so she's saying that it's because he had to polish all of this silver. There was enough silver for like 200 people and he had to do it all day. And so they're just being silly, okay? And we're going to come to learn that Daisy is trying to kind of divert attention from the phone ringing and things like that happening, okay? So pay attention right here. The butler came back and murmured something close into Tom's ear, whereupon Tom frowned, pushed back his chair, and without a word went inside. As if his absence quickened something within her, Daisy leaned forward again, her voice glowing and singing. "I love to see you at my table, Nick. You remind me of a rose, an absolute rose, doesn't he?" She turned to Miss Baker for confirmation. "An absolute rose?" This was untrue. I am not even faintly like a rose. She was only extemporizing, but a stirring warmth flowed from her as if her heart was going to come out to you. No, I'm going to start over. This was untrue. I was not even faintly like a rose. She was only extemporizing, but a stirring warmth flowed from her, as if her heart was trying to come out to you, concealed in one of those breathless, thrilling words. Then, suddenly, she threw her napkin on the table and excused herself and went into the house. Okay, so picture it. They're eating dinner. The phone rings on the inside. The butler leaves to go answer it. He comes in. He whispers something in Tom's ear. Tom frowns, leaves the table. Daisy, who we know when the phone rang, she and the butler left. She's making fun of the butler, just kind of like teasing. There's no real reason for it. And then when her husband leaves for the phone, she kind of flirts with Nick, and she's just kind of, like just saying like trivial things, insignificant. But then suddenly once, she kind of realizes the situation, or once she doesn't really want to play anymore, she leaves the table. She goes inside to where Tom is on the phone. So it leaves Jordan and Nick at the table by themselves. Okay. And this is important. Miss Baker and I exchanged a short glance, consciously devoid of meaning. I was about to speak when she sat up alertly and said, shh, in a warning voice. A subdued, impassioned murmur was audible in the room beyond, and Miss Baker leaned forward, unashamed, trying to hear. The murmur trembled on the verge of coherence, sank down, mounted excitedly, and then ceased altogether. So she's trying to eavesdrop on Tom and Daisy, who are kind of arguing. They said there's like a heated, excited type of murmur, and it rises up and down, and she's trying to listen. And even when Nick starts to talk, she shushes them. But then when it gets quiet, Nick says again, "This Mr. Gatsby you spoke of is my neighbor." I said, "Don't talk. I want to hear what happens." "Is something happening?" I inquired innocently. "You mean you don't know?" said Miss Baker, honestly surprised. "I thought everybody knew." "I don't." "Why," she said hesitantly, "Tom's got some woman in New York." "Got some woman?" I repeated blankly. Miss Baker nodded. "She might have the decency not to telephone him at dinner time, don't you think?" Okay, I love the fact that we're learning that his cousin's husband is having an affair with some woman in New York, but his cousin's best friend, the main problem she has is that it's rude because she called her during dinner. Not the affair, but it's just rude. Okay, these are different types of people than I want you to grow up to be. Almost before I had grasped her meaning, there was the flutter of a dress and a crunch of leather boots, and Tom and Daisy were back at the table. "It couldn't be helped," cried Daisy with tense gaiety. And that is the end of part 1, Eggs and the Buchanans.